Ethan Cole was 12 years old, heir to skyscrapers and glass towers that touched the sky. Yet, in the middle of his father's marble mansion, he was drowning. Red F's bled across every page of his test papers. Each stroke like a wound carved into his name. Richard Cole, the billionaire who built an empire on ruthless deals, stood over his son like a judge delivering a final sentence. His voice thundered through the study. Worthless. That's what you are. Nothing but a shame to this family. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't cry. He just sat frozen. A small figure swallowed by a chair far too big for him, clutching the pencil as if it were a broken sword. The chandeliers sparkled above, but none of their light reached him. For years. Richard had flown in the best tutors, paid specialists more than most families earned in a lifetime, and still failure. Now, patience was gone. To Richard, money could buy everything except what his son clearly lacked: intelligence. That evening, as the city skyline glowed outside, Richard gave the order that would change Ethan's life forever. Pack his things. I'm done wasting time. A boarding school will break him or bury him. Either way, he won't embarrass me again. Ethan heard every word. His heart clenched tighter than his fists. Boarding school wasn't just exile. It was a grave for forgotten children. And in that instant, the boy who had everything felt he had nothing left. But fate was already moving, quietly preparing to send someone into the mansion who would see what Richard never could. The mansion's iron gates opened on a gray morning, but no one paid attention. Delivery trucks rolled in and out every day. What no one noticed was the woman stepping quietly through the side entrance, a single leather handbag worn from years of use slung over her shoulder. Her name was Grace Johnson, 32, dark curls tucked under a faded scarf, shoes scuffed by countless miles, uniform plain and pressed by her own hand. To the house staff, she was just another maid, a body to replace the last one who had quit in frustration. In the pantry, whispers curled like smoke. She won't last a month. The boy will drive her out like the rest. Spoiled rich kids always do. Laughter followed, low and dismissive, as if her fate had already been written. Grace didn't answer. She had learned long ago that the loudest voices were usually the blindest. Instead, she unpacked her supplies with meticulous care, dusting rags folded neatly, bottles aligned, her movements precise and steady. Every gesture carried the discipline of someone who knew respect for the smallest task was respect for herself. But beneath her calm, Grace carried a history no one here could see. Years ago, in a cramped kitchen with peeling wallpaper, a little girl sat at a table fighting tears because the letters on her page refused to stay still. That girl was Grace. She remembered the humiliation of teachers shaking their heads, classmates whispering that she was slow, broken, useless. She remembered the sting of failure until one night. Her mother sat beside her, traced letters in the air, and whispered, "Baby, the words don't hate you. They just look different to you. We'll figure them out together." It wasn't magic. It was patience, night after night. Her mother slowed the world down until Grace could catch it. By the time her mother passed away, the lesson was burned into her soul. No child is broken. They just need someone who refuses to give up. Now, walking the marble halls of Richard Cole's empire, Grace carried that truth inside her like a hidden torch. She hadn't come to teach. She hadn't come to change anyone's life. But fate rarely asked permission. Late that afternoon, as she dusted the banister near the study, she heard it, the desperate scratching of a pencil, followed by a groan so raw it cut through the polished silence of the house. Grace froze. The sound was too familiar. She edged closer to the half-open door. There he was, Ethan Cole, shoulders tense, blonde hair falling over his eyes as he pressed the pencil so hard it tore the paper. Test sheets littered the desk, scarred with eraser marks, ripped edges, angry scribbles. His small hand trembled. knuckles white. Grace's chest tightened. She knew that frustration, the shame that boiled when words refused to make sense. She had seen it in her own reflection as a child. For a moment, she almost stepped back. Maids weren't supposed to interfere, but then Ethan's eyes flicked up, wide, guarded, bracing for another scolding. Instead of scorn, he found Grace watching with a softness that unsettled him. She tilted her head and said quietly, "You grip that pencil like it's a sword. No wonder the paper's fighting back." The boy blinked. Confusion cracked through the shield he wore every day. No tutor had ever spoken like that. No adult had compared his struggle to a battle worth fighting. Grace didn't press. She picked up a crumpled paper from the floor, smoothed it out with care, and placed it gently on the desk. Then she turned back to her dusting, humming low, as if she hadn't just planted the first seed. But Ethan noticed. That night, lying in his oversized bed, he replayed her words again and again. No wonder the paper's fighting back. For the first time in months, he drifted into sleep without the crushing weight of failure on his chest. Grace had arrived, and the mansion, though it didn't know it yet, would never be the same. The study was suffocating. Heavy mahogany shelves lined the walls, stacked with books Ethan Cole could never conquer. The chandelier glittered above, mocking him with its brilliance, while his test paper sat in a heap of torn, crumpled failures. Ethan pressed the pencil harder, his knuckles pale. The letters on the page twisted, slipped, and ran from him like shadows. Every time he thought he had them pinned, they blurred, rearranged themselves, laughing at him in secret. The harder he tried, the more the page rebelled. His throat tightened. Heat burned in his chest. He hated the paper. He hated himself. And then, a sound, a soft intake of breath behind him. Ethan's shoulders stiffened. He turned sharply toward the half-open door, already expecting another scolding, another sharp word, another adult who would remind him what a disappointment he was. Instead, there was Grace Johnson, the new maid. She didn't storm in. She didn't cross her arms. She simply stood there with her dustcloth hanging loose at her side, her eyes locked on his paper, her expression not pity, not disgust, but recognition. For a heartbeat. The room froze. Ethan's face hardened, ready to defend himself. "I know," he muttered under his breath. "I'm failing. You don't have to say it." But Grace didn't echo his father's words. She didn't tell him he was worthless. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, voice soft, almost amused. "You grip that pencil like it's a sword. No wonder the paper's fighting back." Ethan blinked. The words knocked the breath from him. Nobody had ever described his struggle like that. Nobody had ever suggested that maybe the problem wasn't him, but the way he was forced to fight? Confusion cracked his armor, his frown loosened, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" he whispered. Grace didn't answer directly. She stepped into the room, picked up one of his discarded papers, and smoothed it gently across the desk. Her touch was deliberate, tender, as if she were handling something valuable, not trash. She laid it flat before him, then simply returned to dusting, humming a low tune from somewhere far away. The boy stared after her. His chest was still tight, but something shifted. She hadn't mocked him. She hadn't scolded him. She'd seen him, and for the first time, he didn't feel like a monster trapped in his father's shadow. That night, Ethan lay awake in his bed. The mansion was silent, but her words rang louder than the echo of his father's voice. "You grip that pencil like it's a sword. No wonder the paper's fighting back." He whispered it to himself over and over. For the first time in months, he fell asleep not hating himself, but wondering if maybe, just maybe, the battle wasn't lost. The study was darker that evening. Rain lashed against the tall windows, Streaking the glass like tears the mansion refused to shed. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside Ethan Cole's chest. His test papers lay abandoned, the pencil rolling across the desk, the battlefield quiet after another day of defeat. Grace Johnson appeared in the doorway again, carrying only a rag in one hand, but her presence carried a weight heavier than thunder. Ethan didn't look up at first. He sat slumped, forehead pressed to his arm. "Another bad day?" Grace asked softly. Ethan's voice cracked, brittle as the paper under his fist. "I can't do it. The letters don't stay still. They move around, like they're laughing at me. Everyone says I'm broken." Grace stepped inside Bimopmao, pulled out a chair, and sat beside him. She didn't correct him, didn't rush to deny his pain. She simply let the silence stretch long enough for Ethan to realize she wasn't leaving. Then, in a tone that was steady and certain, she said, "You're not broken. You just see the world in a different rhythm. My mama used to tell me the same thing." Ethan turned his head, suspicious. His blue eyes narrowed. "You? You had this too?" Grace smiled faintly. "Worse than you? I thought words hated me, but my mama showed me they didn't. They just needed me to slow down, to breathe, to catch them one by one instead of all at once." She took the boy's pencil, set it aside, then flattened a fresh sheet of paper in front of him. "Let's try something different." Grace lifted her finger and traced an invisible letter in the air, slow and deliberate, as if painting the outline of a constellation. "See that? That's an A. Watch again." She repeated the shape, this time guiding Ethan's hand to mimic the motion. "Now," she whispered, "try it on the desk. Not with the pencil. With your finger. Feel it." Ethan hesitated. His hand hovered, trembling. Then, cautiously, he traced the shape on the polished wood. His finger wobbled, but it was his. His breath caught. Grace nodded. "Good. Now, let's give that shape a sound." She pressed her lips together and drew the sound out like a melody. "Ah," Ethan repeated. It cracked at first, weak, but it was there. "Again, Shika," Grace said. "Let the sound breathe." He tried once more, slower this time. The room seemed to shrink around him, the chandeliers and marble vanishing until there was only his finger, the desk, and the sound. "A." Grace's smile widened. She clapped softly, the sound warm and honest. "Yes, that's it. That's yours now." They moved on, slowly, patiently. She didn't rush him through whole sentences. She broke each letter into pieces, into shapes and sounds that matched the rhythm of his breathing. When he stumbled, she didn't scold, she simply reset. When he flushed red with shame, she told him. "It's not a mistake. It's just another step." Minutes turned into an hour, and the storm outside raged, but inside, something extraordinary unfolded. Grace opened Ethan's textbook, placed her finger under a single line, and read aloud slowly. "The sun sets behind the hill." "Your turn, give me," she said gently. Ethan's chest tightened. The letters wavered. His lips trembled. I can't." "Yes, you can. One word at a time. Just like we practiced." He forced the first word. It came out shaky, well, but it came. Grace nodded. "Good. Next." Son." His throat tightened, but he pushed through. Grace whispered encouragement, steady as the rain. "Keep going." Ethan's finger traced the desk with each word, grounding him. "Sets, behind, His breathing quickened, heart hammering. One word left. His lips parted. doubt clawing at him. But Grace's eyes held his, unwavering. He whispered the final word. Hill. For a moment, silence. The air thickened. Ethan stared at the page as if it had betrayed him. Then realization struck. He had done it. He had read an entire sentence. His mouth fell open. His eyes widened. His chest heaved as though he had just scaled a mountain no one believed he could climb. I did it. His voice trembled, part disbelief, part triumph. Grace's hands clapped again, louder this time, pride radiating from her. Yes, Ethan, you did it. The boy's face transformed. The shame that had weighed on him for years cracked open, replaced by a fragile but undeniable smile. His shoulders straightened. For once, he didn't feel small. That night, Ethan carried the textbook to bed with him. Under the covers, with only the faint glow of a lamp, he read the sentence again, and again, and again. The words didn't fight him anymore. For the first time, they bowed to his rhythm. For the first time, Ethan Cole felt like he was winning, and Grace, sitting in her small servants' quarters, whispered a prayer of thanks to her mother. The lesson lived on, and so did hope. The days that followed were nothing short of war. Not the kind fought with guns and steel, but a quieter, crueler war, one between a boy and the letters that had tormented him his entire life. Every afternoon, the study became their battlefield. Ethan Cole sat at the wide oak desk, his fists clenched, face red with effort, while Grace Johnson stood beside him, calm as a soldier who had fought this battle before. Some days began with hope. Ethan's eyes would light up when he recognized a word, his grin flashing like sunlight through storm clouds. But more often, the storm won. He would stumble, the letters would blur, and his hands would slam against the desk. Papers would crumple under his fists, flying across the room like surrender flags. I can't, he would shout, tears brimming. It doesn't work. I'll never get it. But Grace never flinched. She would quietly pick up the crumpled sheets, smooth them out, and place them back on the desk. Then she would say the same words, steady and unshakable. You are not broken. You just need a different rhythm. The phrase became a lifeline. At first, Ethan didn't believe it. But Grace repeated it with such certainty that eventually, even in his lowest moments, he clung to it like a rope pulled tight above a pit. The staff noticed. They whispered in corridors, mocking her behind polished doors. She's just a maid. Teaching him? Ridiculous. The boys cursed, and she'll ruin herself trying. But Ethan noticed something different. When the clock struck 4, he would glance at the door, waiting for her to appear with her soft smile and her endless patience. For the first time in his life, he looked forward to learning. Not because he suddenly loved books, but because Grace made him believe the fight wasn't hopeless. Their sessions were raw. Some afternoons ended with Ethan sobbing into his arms, his shoulders shaking. Grace would sit beside him silently, her hand resting lightly on the desk until his breathing steadied. Other days, he would erupt in anger, tearing pages to shreds. Grace never raised her voice. She would simply gather the scraps and remind him. Every torn page is proof you tried. That means more than doing nothing. Slowly, something shifted. His writing steadied. His stumbles lessened. A single sentence turned into 2, then 3. The victories were small, but each one planted deeper roots in his confidence. And while the mansion staff continued to gossip, Ethan carried a secret fire inside him. Each day, when Grace knocked softly on the study door, his heart leapt. It wasn't fear anymore. It was hope. The mansion was silent that morning. Not the peaceful silence of comfort, but the heavy, suffocating silence of judgment waiting to fall. Ethan Cole sat at the oak desk in the study, his pencil sharp, his back straight. For the first time, there was no slouch, no trembling, only focus. Grace Johnson lingered by the doorway, rag still in her hand, pretending to dust the molding. In truth, her heart pounded harder than Ethan's. She had prepared him for this moment, but now it was his battle alone. The test lay before him. No expensive tutor hovered nearby, no specialist with a clipboard, just a boy and the page that had always mocked him. Ethan inhaled slowly, tracing the edge of the desk with his finger. Grace had taught him that. Feel the rhythm. Slow down. One breath. One word at a time. He began. His pencil scratched across the paper. His lips moved silently as he read the questions. His hand shook once, but he steadied it. Every answer was a war. Every line of writing a victory. Hours passed like minutes. When he finally set the pencil down, his palms were slick, but his eyes were steady. This time, he didn't shove the paper under his bed. He stood, gripping it like a sword won in battle. The hallway seemed endless as he walked toward his father's office. Each step echoed like a drumbeat of fate. Richard Cole sat behind his massive desk, towers of contracts surrounding him like walls of prejudice. He didn't glance up at first, too consumed by numbers that build empires. When Ethan entered, Richard sighed, impatient. "What is it?" His voice was sharp enough to cut stone. Ethan stepped forward, hand trembling slightly, and placed the paper on the desk. "My test," he whispered. Richard barely looked. He picked it up with the same disdain he always carried. His eyes skimmed the top corner and froze. An A. Not a pity grade, not a curve, a clean, undeniable A. The billionaire's brow furrowed. He flipped through the pages, searching for error, for some mistake, for proof that the grade was false, but line after line was correct. Every answer stood solid. He looked up sharply, his cold eyes piercing his son. How? Ethan didn't speak. His lips parted, but no words came. Instead, his gaze shifted toward the doorway. Richard followed it. There stood Grace, quiet, still holding her rag, her presence humble yet unshakable. For the first time, Richard truly saw her, not as a maid, not as disposable staff, but as the woman who had achieved what money could not. The silence was deafening. Ethan's breath quickened. He braced for his father's rage, for accusations, for dismissal. But none came. Richard leaned back slowly, the paper trembling in his hand. His empire had taught him that everything had a price, but this was something money had never bought. His voice was low, reluctant, almost human. "You saved him." Grace's eyes flickered sight, but she didn't respond. She simply bowed her head slightly, as though the moment belonged not to her, but to the boy standing tall before his father. For the first time in his life, Ethan Cole did not feel worthless. For the first time, his father had no words sharp enough to cut him down. The study door shut with a soft click, but the echoes of that moment thundered through every hall of the Cole mansion. Richard Cole, a man who had built towers of steel and glass, had spoken words no servant had ever expected to hear. "You saved him, Bill," he had said to Grace Johnson. Those words clung to her chest as she walked back to the servants' quarters, her eyes burning, her throat tight. She had not done it for recognition. She had not even done it for Richard's approval. She had done it for Ethan, the boy who once believed he was broken. But now the walls of the mansion began to shift. The next morning, Richard summoned Grace to his office. She braced herself, half expecting a retraction, a scolding for overstepping her role. Instead, Richard leaned forward, the test paper still lying between them. His voice was heavy, reluctant, but undeniable. "From now on, Wake," he said, "you are not the maid. You are his tutor. Name your raise. Whatever it takes, you stay by his side. Grace swallowed hard. She nodded, steady on the outside, though her heart pounded like a drum. And so the new chapter began. Ethan's lessons no longer took place in secret. The study became their arena of triumphs and failures, open now to the eyes of the household. The staff who had once whispered and mocked found themselves silenced by results they could not deny. Week after week, Ethan improved. His handwriting grew steadier. His reading no longer stumbled. He began to solve problems with a confidence that startled even himself. At school, teachers raised their brows in disbelief. "Is this the same boy?" they whispered in the faculty lounge. "He used to fail everything. Now he's brilliant." But brilliance wasn't the right word. It was persistence. It was rhythm. It was grace. Ethan returned home with papers marked with B's, then A's, and instead of shoving them into drawers, he carried them proudly into the kitchen. The staff watched in stunned silence as he smoothed each paper across the refrigerator door with magnets. Even when the grades weren't perfect, he displayed them like trophies. Grace would stand beside him, quiet pride swelling in her chest. "Progress," she would whisper to him, "matters more than perfection." And Ethan believed her. The mansion itself began to sound different. Where once footsteps echoed in cold corridors, now laughter spilled from the study. Grace's voice, steady and patient, mixed with Ethan's occasional groans. Then his bursts of joy when a breakthrough came. Servants who once avoided eye contact now paused at the doorway, peeking in with quiet smiles. They saw a boy who was no longer drowning, but learning how to swim. Richard, too, monsieur, began to notice. At first, he observed from a distance, standing silently in the doorway as Ethan worked through problems with Grace. He said nothing, but the hardness in his eyes softened, if only for a moment. Then, one evening, Ethan walked into the dining room holding a test marked with a bold A. He placed it on the table before his father without trembling. Richard stared at it, then at his son. For a long time, he said nothing. Finally, he nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Good work." The words were simple, but to Ethan, they were gold. His chest swelled with pride, not because of the grade, but because his father had finally seen him. Grace's role in the mansion transformed. She was no longer invisible staff. She was the steady presence at Ethan's side, the one who turned silence into growth. The other servants, once skeptical, now spoke her name with respect. She did what no one else could, they admitted. Not even the tutors from abroad. Richard still struggled to express gratitude, but his actions spoke. Grace no longer scrubbed floors or dusted chandeliers. Her duties were Ethan, and Ethan alone. And Ethan thrived. One night, as rain fell again outside, Ethan sat with Grace in the study. His books were open, his handwriting neat, his voice strong as he read aloud. Halfway through, he stopped and looked at her. "Do you think I'll ever be smart like the other kids?" he asked quietly. Grace leaned closer, her eyes warm. "Ethan, you already are. Smart doesn't mean easy. Smart means you never gave up. And that's exactly what you've done." The boy smiled, the shadows of shame finally lifting from his face. The Cole mansion, once a palace of wealth but not of love, now breathed differently. Its walls held the sound of pencils scratching, of voices reading aloud, of laughter where once there had only been silence and scorn. The transformation was not just in Ethan, it was in the entire family. The Cole mansion had once been a fortress of silence, its marble halls echoing only with footsteps and disappointment. But now, laughter drifted through the corridors. Voices carried warmth instead of judgment, and the boy who once hid his face behind crumpled papers now pinned his tests proudly to the refrigerator door. Richard Cole, the man who believed money could buy anything, respect, loyalty, even brilliance, found himself confronted with a truth he could neither purchase nor deny. He would sit at the end of the long dining table, contracts and ledgers piled around him, but his eyes strayed often to the study door. Inside, he could hear Ethan's steady voice reading aloud. Each word was a miracle. Each sentence was a victory. One evening, Richard finally spoke, not in anger, not in command, but in confession. He called Grace into his office. The storm outside rattled the windows, but inside, the storm was his own. "I built skyscrapers," he began, his voice low, rough with something unfamiliar, regret. "I crushed men in boardrooms. I've never lost a deal, but I almost lost my son because I thought pressure could make him strong. All it did was break him." Grace stood silent, waiting. Richard exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "Money couldn't save him. Tutors couldn't fix him. But you showed me something I never understood. Patience, compassion. That's what he needed. That's what I never gave." His hand trembled as he set aside the test paper marked with Ethan's bold A. "You saved him. And in doing so, you saved me from myself." For the first time, Richard Cole, billionaire, tycoon, titan, bowed his head, not in defeat, but in humility. Ethan, too, had changed. Once, he believed he was broken, cursed, unworthy of love or pride, but Grace's words had stitched something back together inside him. "You're not broken," she had told him again and again. "You just need a different rhythm." Now, he understood. He wasn't less. He wasn't worthless. He wasn't his father's disappointment. He was Ethan Cole, a boy with battles no one could see, but victories no one could take away. At school, teachers marveled. Classmates who once sneered now watched in awe as he raised his hand, as he read aloud without shame. For Ethan, each word was not just a sound, but a declaration. "I am not broken. I never was." And Grace Johnson, the maid who had walked into the mansion with nothing but a worn handbag and a history of struggle, became the miracle no one expected. She never sought recognition. She never demanded reward. But through her patience, she proved a truth that shook the walls of wealth and power. Sometimes, the greatest saviors are the people the world overlooks. Her presence was a reminder that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, strength is quiet. Sometimes, strength is a hand steadying yours when you feel like tearing the page apart. Sometimes, strength is someone whispering, "You're not broken." The final transformation was not in Ethan alone, nor in Richard. It was in the lesson the entire mansion carried now. Intelligence does not bloom under pressure. It blooms under patience. Money can build towers, but it cannot build confidence. Status can command obedience, but it cannot command love. And pressure can force results, but it cannot create brilliance. Only patience can. Only compassion can. As the story closed, Ethan pinned another paper to the refrigerator. This one, not an A, not even a B, but a C+. Yet he grinned with pride, because he knew progress was the real prize. Grace stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, her eyes glistening with quiet triumph. Richard watched from the doorway, and for the first time, instead of seeing a son who had failed him, he saw a boy who had risen. The mansion, once a palace of cold marble, had finally become a home, and the message that lingered in every corner, in every heart, was this: sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to give up, to remind you that you were never broken to begin with. From a broken boy to a proud fighter, Ethan's journey proves money can't buy patience. Only love can. Grace's courage changed a billionaire's home forever, like Share and subscribe to our channel for more life-changing stories that inspire hope, strength, and second chances.